had to say there at The Hague. What did you make of his address?
Thanks for having me. Well, the creation of an international tribunal is a very important step in bringing Russia to justice for its many war crimes. This is something that many Ukrainians have been asking for. Look, I think the feeling here is that the wheels of justice have been turning very slowly. Already we're into year 2 of Russia's full-scale invasion. It's been a long time in the Ukrainian kind of mind, in the Ukrainian heart, which is really bleeding right now, when those, for example, war crimes in Bucha and Irpin have been committed. So on the plus side for the Ukrainians, they have a lot of expertise here built up in terms of investigating war crimes, in terms of collecting irrefutable evidence. So that should speed the process. But on a final note on this, we all know by now that Russia does not subscribe to the rules-based international order. They, for example, did not subscribe to the decisions out of The Hague in terms of the downing of MH17. They won't hand over suspects. So that's going to be very difficult for justice to be achieved in that regard.
The comments that have been coming from the Kremlin in the last few minutes, alleging that the United States, that Washington were involved in that so-called attack on the Kremlin by Ukraine, that drone attack. What did you make of the timing?
Predictable and complete nonsense. It's entirely out of the predictable Kremlin playbook. I very much believe that this was a Russian false flag operation that serves 2 purposes. One is to stoke the domestic audience, to further create more fertile conditions, perhaps for more wide mobilization and for an escalation of the war. But secondly, to really, this almost sends a chill down my back, quite frankly, to create the conditions for Russia to make a direct strike on an important government installation in Kiev, perhaps even the office of the president. So it doesn't appear that this is something Ukraine had the capability of pulling off or even wanted to pull off, because the Ukrainian security services know Mr. Putin spends very little time in the Kremlin. Finally, it could have been a private operation, perhaps opponents within Russia, or perhaps freelancers that are pro-Ukrainian. But it's whatever way you look at it, it's a very bad turn of events, I believe.
Just referring back to that domestic audience that you mentioned, do they still have the appetite for this so-called special operation?
Oh, it looks like the appetite for that so-called special military operation is really falling. We saw that, for example, when the first mobilization was announced. Every Russian who could would flee Russia or go into hiding, or forge papers. So I think also what this strike on this alleged strike does, also the strikes recently on oil depots, it brings the war further to the doorsteps of Russians across the country, and I can't believe they have much of an appetite for this.
Well, obviously, there's been much accusation that the United States was involved in this. If I could just take a moment to remind viewers of the response to the incident, saying that it did not find it possible to recognise the obvious, a terrorist act planned by the regime of Zelensky and an attempt on the life of the president of the Russian Federation. The United States have said, or implied like you have, that this is a false flag operation. Would Russia really risk a direct strike on Kyiv?
I'm afraid so. When the Russians are backed into a corner, in fact, President Putin has used this imagery before, like a rat backed into a corner. What they do is they strike back, and they strike back hard. So as I tweeted yesterday, in the early hours of this morning, is that it's very much according to their Russian playbook, that they're probably due to do something very damaging, very ill thought out, and something which will really escalate things. So I think the West should not underestimate the level of the Russian kind of stupidity in this regard. They could also do things like they have control of that Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And they also, as we all know, have in their arsenal tactical nuclear weapons. So it isn't going to be easy. And I know it's not easy for Ukrainians to be sleeping right now or tonight or in the days to follow. In fact, I have been told by a senior Western diplomat that the staff at the Ukrainian parliament have been advised not to come to work for the next 2 days. That's how tense things are in Kiev right now.
The Kremlin said that Russia has multiple response options on the table. Do you believe that President Putin really would go that far?
All we have to do is look at the history of Russia in various combat theaters, whether it's Syria, Chechnya, elsewhere, whether it's poisoning British nationals on British soil. There are no boundaries. There are no red lines. We have seen so many red lines in this particular conflict crossed that we should be prepared for anything. Again, a very, very chilling thought, but I really urge Western leaders to have a serious look at this and not underestimate the resolve of the Kremlin to do something very violent and, again, very ill thought out.
OK. Michael Bociurkiw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and also former spokesman for Ukraine at the Intergovernmental Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you very much for joining us live from Odessa.